162 Volksjäger or People's Fighter as an aircraft which could be mass-produced very rapidly.
From photographs and drawings, Japanese designers managed to produce their own workable engine. They called it the NE-20.
The fact that the Japanese engineers were able to take a few sketches and a few photographs of a jet engine and build their own version is a tribute, in fact, to their genius. They weren't simply copying, they had to know an awful lot, they had to be really creative. And it just shows, even at that stage, how advanced the Japanese aviation industry was.
The Imperial Navy planned to use this new engine in yet another Japanese version of the German Me-262. It was called the Kika, meaning Mandarin orange blossom. The first operational Kika flies over Tokyo Bay on August 7, 1945, just 8 days before the war ends.
Even though the jet engine was smaller and put out less thrust than the German counterpart, so was the Kika. It was more lightly built and a smaller airplane. So when putting the two together, it was assumed that the Kika could have been developed into a fighter or a bomber, very much like that of performance of the Messerschmitt 262. It would have been a major surprise to Allied fighters.
But jets were not the only secret aircraft Japan was working on. When we return, Japanese development strikes out on its own to design aircraft light years ahead of their time, including the world's first combat helicopter.
You're watching Secret Japanese Aircraft of World War II on the History Channel.
Pearl Harbor. It is billed as the Japanese attempt to assert its raw supremacy over the U.S. But in reality, the Japanese accomplished a number of strategic goals in the attack. Japan's success depended on its ability to establish and maintain a lifeline to a vital resource: oil. It attacked Pearl Harbor in part to hold the U.S. Navy at bay while she seized the huge oil resources of Dutch Indonesia.
Oil was absolutely central to the Japanese Pacific strategy. It was the American embargo on oil which had been the cause, effectively, of the outbreak of war in 1941, and it was totally critical to the whole Japanese war effort.
To stop the Dutch from setting fire to the oil fields, the Japanese captured them in a daring assault by an elite corps of parachute troops whose officers had been trained in Nazi Germany. The coup brought the Japanese to the shores of Australia and gave them control over most of the Pacific. U.S. forces immediately formed a counterattack plan. Unrestricted submarine warfare would cut Japan off from its captured oil resources before the big formations of B-29s would deliver the final devastating blow.
The American submarine campaign effectively blockaded the Japanese home islands, starved them of food, starved them of raw materials, most of all starved them of oil.
As America fought back across the Pacific, its submarines swept the seas of Japanese merchant ships. When the home islands began to run out of fuel, Japanese designers began to plan ways of outwitting the U.S. submariners. The result was one of the most forward-thinking designs in World War II aircraft technology. It was called the Phoenix, after the bird that is reborn from the flames. This Phoenix was a huge tanker aircraft designed to fly petroleum over U.S. subs from the oil fields in Sumatra back to Japan.
The Phoenix project shows how desperate the Japanese were to keep their oil pipeline open. But it was a project born of desperation, because flying large aircraft full of fuel, and they would be slow and lumbering through Allied fighters, was clearly a suicide mission. I don't think the project would have worked in practice.
Japan would need something else to break the sub-blockade. The home waters close to the Japanese coast. A lone U.S. submarine glides in search of its prey. A slow-moving oil tanker, bringing its precious cargo back to power Japanese factories and fighter planes. Suddenly, from nowhere, come lethal depth charges.
The Japanese in World War II were in fact the first nation to deploy rotary wing vertical takeoff aircraft in combat. They used them for two purposes, for artillery spotting and also, dramatically, for anti-submarine warfare.
The first successful helicopter-type machine was called an autogyro and first flew in 1923. Dubbed the flying windmill by the press, the autogyro looked like an airplane, but flew like a helicopter.
The autogyro was a primitive form of helicopter. It was a way stage on the way to the helicopter that we know today.
The Japanese were always quick to pick up on anything new, and in the early 1930s, the autogyro was that new thing. They purchased 2 Khalid autogyros from the United States, brought them to Japan, and evaluated what its performance capabilities could be, what use could they do with the autogyro. And of course, the military picked up on it pretty quick, understanding that this would make a good aerial observation airplane because of its slow speed and able to land into small places.
Shortly after delivery, the Japanese autogyros were destroyed in test flights. But the Army delivered the wreckage to the Kayaba Engineering Company with orders to develop a better machine.
When the Japanese Kayaba Company rebuilt the killer autogyro, they did one brilliant thing. They realized that its limitations as a war machine was the underpowered engine. So they put into it a more powerful German engine, and suddenly they had a weapon of war.
Having seen the military application of the autogyro, the Army ordered production of these airplanes and acquired up to 98 of them. They used them for artillery spotting.
The first Japanese autogyro, named KA-1, flew 6 months before Pearl Harbor. Despite its widespread use in the Philippines, its existence went completely undetected by technical air intelligence, so the machine was never even given an Allied code name. But as the tide of war turned against Japan, the Japanese Army would find a strange new mission for the KA-1.
Strange as it may seem, the Japanese Army operated its own aircraft carriers as well as the Japanese Navy. Often during World War II, the two branches of the Japanese military couldn't get on and would duplicate each other's activities because they simply found it very difficult to cooperate.
The Japanese Army converted a number of transport ships into light aircraft carriers by fitting a small flight deck over the superstructure. As defeat loomed in the war, these carriers were transferred to anti-submarine operations in the hope of protecting the delivery of vital supplies of oil. In a bold move, the transport carrier Akitsumaru was loaded with KA-1s armed with depth charges in April 1944.
For the autogyro, it didn't have too much weightlifting capability, but by eliminating the front seat observer and putting a bomb shackle under that position, they were able to carry a 60-kilogram depth charge. And it might be noted that this is the only operational use of the autogyro that was used in World War II.
But history had another fate in store for the Akitsumaru before the KA-1s could go into action. The aircraft carrier transport was dispatched on a special mission carrying relief supplies to isolated Japanese bases. On November 15, 1944, the U.S. submarine Queenfish sighted the Akitsumaru. Silently, the Queenfish stalked its unsuspecting prey. The sinking of the Akitsumaru put an end to the Army's bold experiment in anti-submarine warfare. But World War II would see other Japanese aerospace plans even more advanced than the helicopter, far in advance of anything the Allies possessed.
You're watching Secret Japanese Aircraft of World War II on the History Channel.
On January 24th, 1990, a rocket blasts off for the moon. It is an amazing 25 years since mankind last sent a rocket to Earth's satellite. But this is neither an American nor a Russian mission. A third nation has opted to explore deep space. The rocket is Japanese, and the roots of its technology lie far back in World War II with one of Japan's most famous aircraft designers, Hideo Itokawa.
Hideo Itokawa is famous in Japanese aviation circles for being famous. By that I mean he was the first person to step out of the traditional Japanese team structure where everyone was faceless and claim his priority as a great aviation designer. And to this day, many Japanese aviation engineers hate him for that.
It is 1939, and Europe is at war. In the Far East, the pilots of the Japanese Army Air Force are testing a radical new fighter plane. At first, they don't like it. The aircraft is the Nakajima Ki-43, Allied code name, Oscar.
While the Japanese Navy had the famous Zero fighter, the Army had their famous fighter too, which turned out to be the Oscar. It was an airplane to tangle with, and in fact, so much that when Allied fighter pilots would meet the Oscar, it was not uncommon for them to call it so many zeros at 12 o'clock high.
Unlike previous fighter planes of the Army, the Oscar had a retractable undercarriage. The Japanese Army pilots were used to lightness and maneuverability in their planes. They thought the retractable undercarriage made the plane too heavy. But Hideo Itokawa, in charge of designing the Oscar's aerodynamics, had invented something that would make the Oscar a fighting legend.
Nakajima designed into two of their major fighters a device called the butterfly flap, namely because that's what it looked like, a butterfly wing. This was a flap that not only was a landing flap and operated the same way, but it could be extended in flight when engaged in combat to add to the turning radius of the airplane.
In the battles to come, Hideo Itokawa's efforts paid off. The Oscar would prove to be one of the most formidable fighters of World War II.
As the war progressed, the Oscar was found to have a drawback. It didn't have the rate of climb, the performance of engine to climb up to catch high-flying US bombers like the B-29. So they needed a different kind of fighter.
That different kind of fighter was already being developed in Nazi Germany. It was called the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet and was powered by a liquid-fueled rocket motor. Discarding its undercarriage on takeoff for maximum aerodynamic efficiency, the Comet could climb like a bat to 30,000 feet in 2.5 minutes.
The Me-163 rocket fighter was designed as a point defense interceptor powered by a rocket motor rather than a jet or a piston engine. Its advantage was that it could climb extremely rapidly to high altitude to intercept bombers. It had distinct disadvantages, however. Its range was very, very limited. Effectively, the rocket fuel was used up in the initial climb. Only one attack could then be made, and the aircraft had to return without power to land.
The Imperial Japanese Navy, despairing that the Army could keep the home skies clear of American bombers, seized on the German Comet as a quick solution to its air defense needs. This Japanese version was called the Shushui, after the swishing sound made by a samurai sword. Building the Shushui was entrusted to the Mit-Zero fighter. On July 7, 1945, the first rocket-powered Shushui thundered off into the sky.
As with other Nazi technology they acquired,